Like and subscribe, otherwise I'm gonna hit you with a wet pool noodle. Okay, what are we talking about today? Revenge of the Baskerville Bloodhound. Um, right off the bat, you should read this. It's really good. I enjoyed it a lot. I'd probably give it like an 8 or a 9. Um, it's just it's just a fun story. I would say there's a lot of like not so unique elements, but those elements are done pretty well. And I would say there are other things that I just really appreciate, like just small things about the story that make me really freaking like this one. Um, so I'd recommend it. There's really not much more to say other than just getting into the gist of what the story's about, in case you're curious. But totally recommend reading this one. Very good. Um, I will say the start might be a little bit slower to get into the stuff that's actually like, that really distinguishes this for me. So you might have to put up with a little bit of junk at the start, but it's not like One Piece where it's like 100 episodes or anything. It's a couple of chapters that are a little like, eh. We could maybe speed things along a little bit. But very good story. So, gist. This guy is reincarnated. Well, I guess you could say it's more so like him going back in time. He's not necessarily in like a different body or anything. It's not an isekai. He's going back in time to before his death. All the way back, actually. Like, he goes straight to like being a baby. But so he goes back in time to basically get revenge. I would struggle to talk about this revenge without getting into specifics. I'm going to do my best, but I'm going to be very general because I don't want to spoil anything in case you have, I've not read this. If you have read it, I'll try to just give my thoughts on how things go. I would say, number one, the revenge story overall, I enjoy. How it's formatted. I think it has like it's a fun like twist and turn kind of revenge story. So I appreciate that. I I think sometimes they don't necessarily set stuff up enough. For those who have read it, and maybe those who haven't, but there's a character later on, let's just say he has a high position in this Baskerville family. And I don't necessarily like what they did with him. I feel like, this character has a lot of importance, right? Like they are like a big deal, okay? This is a big deal character. And how they deal with him, his storyline, I feel like did not have enough setup previously. For those who have read it, I'll just say demon, and you might get the gist. The storyline, I think, was a little disappointing in how its progression was. I would have preferred a little more, build up to this point, right? Just like, when you actually see something like this happen, you're like, whoa, okay. I think all they would really have to do is maybe go into this guy's past a little more than they did prior. Maybe just mention like different characters and things like that, because he's interacted with basically everyone already in the story. But I feel like when they do go back into the past and like talk about some things, they kind of neglected this character. Now I don't know if that's because the author didn't plan for it, or what exactly. Like maybe the author kind of loosely knew where they wanted to go, with this character at the end point here, but they didn't necessarily know that all the way back here, so they didn't build it up. But I don't necessarily think it's terrible or anything. It's just kind of like, it might have been nice to have a little build up. Just a little bit, mentions, do the whole like Madara thing in Naruto where you barely even talk about him. just a little nod. And I feel like, yes, there are some tiny mentions, but I don't know, just a little more like setup where you could look back and be like, whoa, I didn't even think of that. Would have been nice. But it's a minor gripe. I mean, I feel like the vast majority of the story is very smooth in progression. I really like it. His character I really enjoy. He's actually somewhat smart for once in terms of these characters. It's no shocker, but this is one of those series where, like, you know, he's trying to get more powerful, right? And I feel like the problem with a lot of those series is, like, the main character always tries to be zero. Like, they're always like, I'm the lowest rank, or I'm terrible, and everyone, like, knows they're not. But this character actually kind of... I don't know, he shows, like, some of his skill, just not the apex of his skill, which is, like, how you would think someone would do it. Like, you don't want to be treated like dog shit, but you also don't want to necessarily stand out too much. So he kind of does it in the middle, and he kind of keeps some of his cards to himself. Now, he does end up standing out a lot, but he keeps a lot of cards to himself, which I think is a smart play. I don't think it necessarily helps him all the time, but it's still a good play. I don't want to get into, like, super late stuff, so I guess I'll just talk about some early things as well, but the early part is a little slow. You know, it's just kind of like a more basic story with some good, you know, standout moments. I will say there's a part where he goes to this, like, dungeon in order to get a special item, right? And I feel like how the dungeon was set up was kind of brain dead. So, like, there's these two brothers, and for some reason, like, they thought the riddle in the dungeon was, like, about them. Which I feel like they said they're there for, like, 3 years or something? And they didn't even try anything outside of being brothers, and I'm like, this is such a silly setup. I don't even know why the author decided to do it. It led to, like, a disappointing kind of story that, I don't know, downgraded my opinion at the start. I mean, luckily enough, I kept reading, so it ended up getting a lot better, but still, it was one of those things where kind of, like, at the start, you're like, what? Why? But whatever. It's not at the end of the world. It's just one of those things where it's like, the start of the story is really doing everything in its power to hinder the end. But I think once you get through that starting point, like maybe like the first, like, 20 or so chapters, it ends up getting a lot better over time. Which is kind of why it's hard for me to talk about it, because if I'm, like, I mean, that's so far in that it's like, I try to stay below that point, because I don't necessarily want to get into what the whole story is, because this is more so just me talking about it in, like, a review way, and someone just coming by is not... I don't really want to, like, spoil the whole thing for them or whatever, which is why I try to make it more general. But yeah, I mean, I've already kind of said my thoughts on the general idea of just, like, my main issue story-wise is just the demon thing with his household. I don't necessarily love it. At least the setup. The execution isn't terrible or anything. It's just the setup's a little bit wonky. But I will say this again, the revenge, how that plot lays out and everything, really like it. The only other big thing I'll mention is, like, the side characters in this story are kind of middle of the road. Oddly enough, any character that's, like, associated directly with his, like, family, which is the Baskerville family, is pretty good. I like most of them. But, like, a lot of the ones that aren't associated with his family are kind of mid. There's a part with, like, barbarians, which I would say the barbarian part's pretty good. I would say, like, the barbs, they're pretty good. I like most of them and that whole plot progression, but I don't necessarily like a lot of the other side characters. They're kind of mid. Also, I guess I'll just briefly mention this. I wasn't really counting season, like, the second, like, half or season 2 or whatever, but it's going in a direction that I'm not a huge fan of. Anytime you have, like, you know, school in a story like this. Like fantasy school is a bit weird. I'm not a huge fan, and it's mostly just because it's overplayed. Like there's just so many stories that go into that. But it seems like they're doing this okay. I'm not worried, about the story too much. It seems like they're doing it fine. It was just like it's just one of those things where I'm like a little okay, like yeah, you can do that, but let's be a little careful here. But it seems like they're fine for now. We'll see. But so far this whole section seems okay. But yeah, I don't know. We can do the old SAE just to break things down a little bit. So what is the SAE? Well, it's story, art, enjoyment. Story-wise, I think there are some hiccups periodically. So it's definitely not a 10. And I think because the side characters are a little and, some plot points are a little I'd probably go down to an 8. I would say the vast majority of it's really good. But there are some moments where I'm like, ugh. But, whatever. As far as art goes, it is pretty freaking good art. I have to admit, it is solid art. I'm trying to... there's not like a ton of super unique elements, I would say. I mean, there are some things that are a little unique. I also think the aesthetics are very good. I don't know, it kind of gives me a little Bloodborne-y aesthetics later on, like when he's in like the cities and things like that. So I think I'll bump it to an 8. As far as enjoyment goes, I mean, it's really good. I think there were, again, some moments where I'm like, well, that's a little weird, but I would say in comparison to all the other things I've read, this has to be like a 9. It's a very fun series. So overall, it's probably between an 8 and a 9, like I said at the start. If we break this down a little bit, I mean, the story, for the most part's fine. Like I said, 8, but the beginning is a little bit slow, and there's some wonky moments periodically where I'm like, that's a little weird. And I would say that later on, most of it's pretty good. There are a couple of things where I think it would have done better if it, built things up a little more, and maybe it's, going a little too fast. But overall, it's fine. Art-wise, I don't think any of the designs are super unique, but I think the aesthetic is pretty good, which is why I would give it an 8. And it's definitely, like, quality. I don't see any weird, eye placements or things like that. Like, I would say it's overall pretty good. Pretty much from the get-go. It doesn't really... I feel like maybe it gets a little better later on, but the start's perfectly fine. I would say it's high quality. And I like the aesthetic. Enjoyment-wise, I mean, I think it's definitely a 9. Like, I'm comparing this to, probably the last 100 stories that I've read in this month. But, I enjoyed it. I like the small little elements, like the part of the revenge story was really good. I love how that turns out. I think the main character just being a little more, showing that he's smart through his actions rather than other people like glazing him and saying that he's smart. I don't know. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's a very solid experience. I would say objectively, it's probably closer to an 8 than a 9, but it's up to you. I also want to reiterate, like, if you expected like a 10 or something, a 10 for me is my favorite within like a subsect. So like, I don't know, my favorite, isekai action story, or my favorite like romantic comedy or whatever. So I mean, it's not my favorite, so I'm not going to be able to give it a 10. It's very good, and I think maybe at some point I'll, make a list of my top 10s of, all the different genres and things like that, but that's going to take me, a minute to organize, considering how many things I've read. Also, of course, recency bias. That's why I think the like enjoyment thing, I leave it as a separate category because there is an element of recency bias that can be there. Like story and art, I try to be as objective as I can. Enjoyment, I mean, it's just whatever. It's whatever I feel about it. So that I would say is a little less reliable, because maybe a year down the line I'll think this is more of a 7 in terms of enjoyment. So I would say like these are definitely like the more consistent thing. But whatever. Who cares? I'd appreciate if you could like, comment, subscribe, blah blah blah. Maybe leave another story you want me to read down below. Even if I've read it, I'll read it again. And yeah, I'll see you.